Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 19 January 2024. This is the 203rd anniversary of the birth of Ferdinand Gregorovius, who was born in Neidenburg, East Prussia, which is now part of Poland, on this date in 1821. Gregorovius was the author of a multi-volume work on the history of Rome during the Middle Ages, which has been translated into History of the Rome in the Middle Ages, which is not widely read today, but it was a landmark of scholarship in its time. The inspiration for the book is described by K.F. Morrison in an abridgment and translation of Gregorovius. So this is from the introduction by Morrison. Quote, "Standing on the Ponte Fabricio early in the autumn of 1854, he suddenly saw in the buildings and ruins of Rome more than vestiges of one city's aspirations and failures. He saw Rome as a point of intersection for the great forces whose conflict had generated European civilization. The bridge on which he stood witnessed to the heritage of classical Rome. Originally built by the Emperor Otto III, the Church of San Bartolomeo at the foot of the bridge represented the Germanic Empire. Behind him, on the Capitoline, stood the Campidoglio, the stronghold of Roman republicanism in the Middle Ages. Up the Tiber rose St. Peter's, an enduring monument to papal monarchy. For Gregorovius, these buildings were relics, not simply of men, but of the spirit that had moved men, of ideas that had dominated the world, beyond the plane of local politics concerning the short-range fates of intermediate issues and great men. Gregorovius detected a second level, that of universal history, the drama of mankind's advancement through increasingly complete stages of spiritual freedom. In a flash, he grasped the inspiration for the history in these two aspects as something great, something that will lend a purpose to my life," unquote. So that was one translator's introduction account of it. But Gregorovius gave his own account. It was later published in the Roman journals of Gregorovius from 3 October 1854, quote, "I propose to write the history of the city of Rome in the Middle Ages. For this work, it seems to me that I require a special gift, or better, a commission from Jupiter Capitolinus himself. I conceived the thought, struck by the view of the city as seen from the bridge leading to the island of San Bartolomeo. I must undertake something great, something that will lend a purpose to my life," unquote. So if Gregorovius is to believe, he had received his historiographical mission, as it were, in this moment of inspiration on the Pons Fabricio. But I assume in so saying that he was channeling Edward Gibbon, because there's a famous passage in the posthumous autobiography of Gibbon. He wrote the fragments while he was alive, but they were assembled and published after he was dead. But this is a very famous passage where Gibbon talks about his vision of his historiographical mission, as it were. Quote, "It was at Rome on the 15th of October, 1764, as I sat musing amidst the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted friars were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and fall of the city first started my mind. But my original plan was circumscribed to the decay of the city rather than of the empire, and though my reading and reflections began to point towards that object, some years elapsed and several avocations intervened before I was seriously engaged in the execution of that laborious work," unquote. So Gregorovius certainly knew that he was working in Gibbon's shadow when he conceived his mission and wrote his multi-volume work on medieval Rome. He wrote in a letter to Sigmund Muntz that he had returned to Gibbon's original project. Quote, "This conception of medieval Rome as a city originated with me. I gave it a literary form and carried out Gibbon's first idea, for it is well known that he had originally intended to write the history of the city of Rome during the Middle Ages," unquote. So everybody who's been to Rome understands the power of the place, its genius loci. And it affects people in a profound way, as it affected Gregorovius and Gibbon before him. It is, after all, the eternal city, which Tibullus had already called it Urbs Eterna in classical antiquity, so that is an ancient way of referring to the city. Sometimes it is cities, and sometimes it is human beings who are the bearers of the great ideas that have shaped human history. And Gregorovius chose to focus on a city, the city of Rome. We get an interesting contrast to this if we look to Thomas Carlyle, who is well known for the great man theory of history. So this is from the first page of On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic of History by Carlyle. Quote, "As I take it, universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and in a wide sense, creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of the thoughts that dwell in great men sent into the world. The soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these," unquote. Carlyle and the great man theory of history have few friends today. John Romer called Carlyle the balmiest of the Victorians, and that's pretty much where his reputation lies today, except for a few. But Wilhelm Wildeband, who was the philosopher to make the distinction between the nomothetic and the ideographic, that is to say, between the law-like and universal on the one hand and the particularistic on the other hand, had an interesting take on Carlyle. So this is from Wildeband's A History of Philosophy, with special reference to the formation and development of its problems and conceptions. Quote, "Carlyle, who worked himself free from the philosophy of enlightenment by the assistance of German idealism, labored unweariedly for the recognition of the archetypal and creative personalities of history. On the one hand, the life of the masses with the changes taking place conformably to general law. On the other hand, the independent value of that which presents itself but once, and is determined within itself," unquote. So this assimilates Carlyle's conception of the great man theory of history to the nomothetic ideographic distinction. And all that Carlyle and Wildeband say about the individual person, you could say about an individual city. So the urban parallel to Carlyle's great man theory of history, you could call the great city theory of history. And paraphrasing Carlyle, we could say that universal history, the history of what humanity has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of great cities which have evolved here. A great city is like an ideographic exception to the nomothetic rule. And there are other cities like this. At least Gregorovius recognized other cities like this. At the beginning of the history of Rome in the Middle Ages, he noted 3 cities that had had a disproportionate role in human history. Quote, "3 cities shine conspicuous in the history of mankind by reason of the universal influence which they exercised upon it: Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. In the course of the life of the world, all 3 are factors working with and through each other for human civilization," unquote. And there are others besides Gregorovius that we can count in the tradition of the great city theory of history. There's a famous quote that I particularly enjoy from Philotheus of Pskov. Quote, "And now I say unto thee, take care and take heed, pious Czar. All the empires of Christendom are united in thine. For 2 Romes have fallen, and the 3rd exists, and there will not be a 4th. Thy Christian empire, according to the great theologian, will not pass to others," unquote. So for Philotheus, the 3 great cities in history were Rome, Constantinople, and Moscow, whereas for Gregorovius, they were Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. If we wanted to, we could even count St. Augustine among the great city theorists of history. It was the sack of Rome by Alaric and the Visigoths on 24 August 410 that inspired the first great work of philosophy of history in the Western tradition, his City of God. And even though Augustine's attitude is that it doesn't really matter what's happening in the city of man as long as things are going okay in the city of God, still Rome is a central motif in his thought and certainly in the book. And we could call these exemplary cities the ideographic exception to the nomothetic rule. The nomothetic rule of urbanism is given in works like Fustel de Coulanges' The Ancient City, or Henri Pirren's work on medieval cities, or V. Gordon Child's work on the urban revolution as the starting point of civilization. So Coulanges, Pirren, and Child give us the nomothetic background. And the nomothetic background of urbanism is the basis of the exemplary city, the ideographic exception that rises up out of that nomothetic background and asserts itself as being archetypal, a vision of an urban ideal, as it were. As we get, for example, in Plato. Plato describes in the Republic the ideal government of a polis. For Plato, a republic is a polis, a city in its hinterland. It's not what we think of today as a nation state. Aristotle even went into details of city planning in his politics. And Robert Redfield's anthropology centers the great tradition, which is part of his definition of civilization, in cities where there is a literate culture, a written language, the development of higher culture, forms of art, and a priestly class to maintain all these things. For Gregorovius, Rome embodied many of these ideals. And I quote, "All great spiritual and worldly powers received their consecration in Rome. The sources of the priestly power, the power to bind and to loose, the fount of imperial majesty, finally civilization itself, seemed to spring from the hills of Rome, and like the streams of paradise, flow to fertilize the four quarters of the world. All the institutions of mankind had originally sprung from this majestic city," unquote. And Gregorovius is almost as effusive when it comes to specifically medieval Rome, which we have mostly thought of as being a city in a state of abject humiliation as its population fell from an ancient height of about 1 million to being as few as maybe 30,000 people left there. But of medieval Rome, Gregorovius writes, quote, "There were long centuries in the Middle Ages in which Rome was truly the lawgiver, the instructress and the mother of nations, encircling her children with a threefold ring of unity, spiritual in the papacy, temporal in the empire, the crown of which German kings came to receive in St. Peter's, and the unity of that general civilization, which was the bequest of Rome to all the world," unquote. So this is a very idealized portrait of a city and is part of a general idealization of great cities in what I've called here the great city theory of history. But cities have also represented the worst in human history. They've been seen as flesh pots, as dens of vice and iniquity. We all remember the scene in Star Wars where Obi-Wan Kenobi looks down on Mos Eisley and says to Luke, "You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." And in the book of Revelation, Babylon the Great, it is said, that was the habitation of devils and the hold of every foul spirit and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So that was probably in its time said of Rome. Rome was, for the author of Revelations, the Babylon the Great, the great whore of cities, as it were. So these contrasting moral visions of the city as the ideal and as representing the worst tell us something about ourselves, but it gives us a different way of thinking about humanity because we are thinking about it indirectly through the surrogate of cities rather than trying to think directly about ourselves, which is much more difficult and much more open to dishonesty. And this lens, as it were, to see ourselves from a slightly different perspective, to see ourselves through the lens of a city, also provides a lens through which we could see the universe entire, as it were. Because cities can be taken as the middle ground between little big history and big history, properly speaking. So what do I mean by that? Big history tells the story of the universe entire from the Big Bang through the present and up into the future as far as we can see. By contrast to that, Esther Kadeckers has pioneered what she calls little big histories, in which some feature of the world is seen in the light of the history of the universe entire. In her paper, A Case for Little Big Histories, it's included in the Routledge Companion to Big History, she uses the example of a brick, which turns out to be full of interesting possibilities. Between big history proper and little big histories, we could identify a middle ground that we could call meso-history. And all traditional history has been meso-history. The history of states and empires, wars, religions, they're all meso-histories, essentially. Gibbon's Decline and Fall, in spite of its enormous scope, is still a meso-history we could not reasonably call either big history or a little big history. Although some meso-histories, you could say, tend toward the large and could be effortlessly expanded into a big history, properly speaking. We could take Gibbon's Decline and Fall and rewrite it as a big history, extending the past and the future and the scope which we consider the history of Rome. Other meso-histories tend toward the small, and they could be reduced to little histories, to little big histories, I should say. So we could take the history of Rome and reduce it to the city of Rome, and we could reduce the city of Rome to a famous building like the Pantheon, reduce the Pantheon to the bricks that make up the Pantheon, and there we are back at the brick as the topic of a little big history. So even though we can develop an idea toward the large or to the small, there remains a mesoscale that we can give a big history exposition to. And at the level of meso-history, we have a story like that of Rome. Rome is a city built of a great many bricks. Each of its bricks has its own little big history, but the history of the city itself is greater than any one brick. But at the same time, the history of Rome isn't the history of the whole universe, like a big history sensu stricto. So between the little history of a brick and the big history of the universe entire, we have the meso-history of an exemplary city like Rome. Gregorovius didn't give us a meso-history focused on Rome, but we can see the possibility implicit in his work, and we can take the next step ourselves. If we can see history through the lens of a single city, we could just as well see a single city through the lens of history. So here's a thought experiment of a meso-history of Rome. Carl Sagan said in his Cosmos, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. And that is true of every familiar thing around us, like cities. So if we wish to have Rome, we must first invent the universe. And for this, we require the entirety of cosmological history, the formation of the Earth, and as the Earth forms, we wait for the arrangement of the land masses to assume some familiar shape as a consequence of the supercontinent cycles that have been going on for billions of years. In the meso-history of Rome, we witness the formation of the Mediterranean basin, which is repeatedly filled with seawater, then cut off as the Pillars of Hercules close, dries out for tens of thousands of years, concentrating salt in the bottom, fills up again, both from the Nile, and then when the Pillars of Hercules open up again to the sea. And this happens many times until a familiar pattern comes into view, and we see a coastline we recognize. And we see the formation of the 7 hills of Rome. and a network of roads growing out from Rome like arteries carrying the lifeblood of the Republic and then the empire. The Romans have the veneration of their own history. They preserve the Casa Romuli, which is supposedly the hut in which Romulus lived. So they have their own cultivation of history that is embedded within and nested within their own history. And we are nesting that history within the big history of the cosmos. The very cobblestones of Trastevere are called San Pietrini, come from the local volcanic rock that we saw forming earlier as the whole Mediterranean basin was forming and the peninsula that we now call Italy was forming. And then we can see ancient Rome at its height, 1 million strong, and in the blink of an eye of historical time, Rome is sacked and humiliated, depopulated and nearly abandoned. Then the long road back, repeatedly sacked and built up again. All the while, artifacts are being found, and many are still unfound. Some are on the ground that will never be found in the history of civilization. They will be conveyed into an unknown future, and then into the far future of Rome, when the city is eventually abandoned and nature takes over. The Tiber alternatively floods and dries up, changes its course. The modern buildings crumble to nothing while the ancient structures remain and are covered over as volcanoes come back to life in the Alban Hills and the Sabatini volcanic complex, covering the remains of the city in volcanic ash and lava flows. By this time, the city is broken apart by geomorphological forces. Parts of it are destroyed, other parts encased in sedimentary rock and preserved for millions of years, then tens of millions of years, then hundreds of millions of years in the crust of the earth. 5 billion years pass and the sun becomes a red giant and then a white dwarf. And still the remnants of Rome are preserved in the rocky crust of earth and go on to become an eternal city on a cosmic scale. The cosmological eschatology of Rome could disperse in many directions in the far future. Parts of the city would be returned to the mantle and melted until the supercontinent cycle grinds to a halt. Parts of the city remain locked in sedimentary rock, and when Earth ultimately breaks up and makes our sun into a polluted white dwarf, perhaps visible to others, a polluted white dwarf is a white dwarf surrounded by planets that are breaking up, and debris from the planets impact on the surface of the star, and we can turn telescopes to that star and do a spectroscopic analysis of the polluted white dwarf so we can actually know the chemical composition of the planets that were formerly orbiting around that star. So when Earth 5 billion years or more in the future begins to break up and impact on the remnant of a white dwarf, it could become a polluted white dwarf seen by alien telescopes billions of years from now. Other portions of the entombed eternal city, encased still within what remains of the Earth, as the Earth breaks up, might be floating through the local cluster, sent on unlikely trajectories by the gravitational forces that will tear apart the solar system when the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy collide together and throw everything in the two galaxies in different pathways. We could even imagine some bits and pieces of what was Earth and what was the eternal city falling into a supermassive black hole and attaining the physical equivalent of eternity as the gravitational forces slow down time to an imperceptible crawl, and some fragment of the eternal city is conveyed into the far distant cosmological future of the universe and becomes an almost eternal history of the eternal city. Gregorovius doesn't take us this far, but like Virgil conducting Dante through hell and purgatory, he can take us on our initial steps of the journey. So happy birthday to Gregorovius, and thanks for listening.